All across America and around the world, this is Veterans Radio. This is Veterans Radio.
Good day. I'm Jim Fausone. I'm the officer of the deck today here on Veterans Radio, and thanks for joining us. We've got some interesting stories for you. We always want to remind you you can find more about Veterans Radio at its Facebook site or at the web, veteransradio.org, where we're on the web 24/7. You can find a lot of our podcasts there as well. We post new ones every Tuesday, so you can get a new story, a new interview, something you didn't know before by going to veteransradio.org. And before we get started, we want to thank our sponsors. First up, we want to thank Legal Help for Veterans. Legal Help for Veterans fights for veterans' disability rights all across the nation. You can reach them at 800-693-4800 or on the web at legalhelpforveterans.com. We just want to remind you that Veterans Radio podcasts are available on all your favorite streaming platforms, including RSS.com, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube Podcasts, iHeartRadio, and Rees Across America Radio. So wherever you are, you can find us, whether it's on your mobile phone or your computer or your laptop, your tablet. But listen in to Veterans Radio Podcasts. We post something new every week, and you're going to find it informative. Today's interviews that we're going to provide are really topical. We're going to have an interview with a retired Navy and Foreign Service gentleman about the tanker wars at the Strait of Hormuz back in the 80s. So time passes, but the same problems exist. So I think you're going to find that interesting. And then we're going to talk to a doctor, military medicine man, talking about how drone injuries are creating a change in military medicine. And if you're paying any attention to the Ukraine-Russian war, you know drone injuries are happening. And he's going to provide us some insight. So stay tuned. You're going to find these both pretty fascinating. We want to welcome to Veterans Radio Tom Duffy, Navy commander retired, U.S. Foreign Service diplomat of 32 years with postings pretty much all around the world, but for relevant purposes, time in the Middle East. Tom also has taught at the U.S. National War College in D.C. You got your undergrad from Notre Dame, where you were an ROTC candidate, and MA in War Studies at King's College, London, and a graduate of the U.S. Naval War College. Woo! What a background, Tom. Welcome to Veterans Radio.
Hey, thank you very much for having me today.
Well, we're going to combine your naval experience with your Foreign Service experience to talk about a book that you've written, Tanker War in the Gulf. It's right over your shoulder there, and it's an interesting story about Operation Earnest Will, which everybody's kind of probably forgotten about, but as they like to say, if you don't know your history, you repeat your history, and we're going to talk about how this relates to what's going on today. So, but Tom, give us a little bit of your naval history and a little bit of your Foreign Service history.
Yeah, thank you. So, I always tell people I was much more in danger in the Foreign Service than I ever was in the Navy. And that's just a function of where they send you and where it goes. So I ended up serving in Colombia, in the Foreign Service, and a lot of places in the Middle East. But in the Navy, so I graduated from college and got sent to the USS Cochrane, which is a destroyer homeported in Japan. And one day we're sitting there and we read in Stars and Stripes, because there's no internet at that point. We're just reading in Stars and Stripes about the strike on the USS Stark in the Persian Gulf. And 3 days later, we find ourselves steaming south to the Persian Gulf to get involved. What's going to become Earnest Will? And I think this is probably the case for all veterans, right? When you're involved in these operations, it's just sort of day to day for you, right? It's just like, this is what we do. It isn't until
nobody told you the big picture. You're what right. Are you, a Lieutenant JG or something?
Right, I'm a Lieutenant JG at the time, right?
Yeah, they're not explaining to you why you're going. You're just going, right?
Right. And so, and I don't need to know the big picture to do my job. I'm the missile officer. The missile officer and the fire control officer. Our job is to make, radar go away, as they like to say.
Yeah.
So I don't really need to know all of this. But afterwards, I get out of the Navy and I don't know what to do next. And I decided just to go to the University of London, mainly because in college, all these people had gone to London for a semester, which I couldn't do because of my ROTC commitments. And they were just insufferable with their stories. So I said, I'm going to go to London too. And so I ended up in a master's program that turns out to be a lot more reputable than I realized. And I have to write on something. And so my friends at King say, hey, you've just come back from Ernest Well. Why don't you write on that? And so I did my master's thesis on that. And then, 35 years later, a book.
Well, and again, it's one of those things that when you're in the middle of it, you don't see the big picture. 35 years later, there's a lot of big picture to understand because you can grab a lot of research and history. And as I say, it relates a little bit to what's going on today. So let's refresh people. Tell folks about what Operation Earnest Will was about in 1987.
Sure. So it starts back even a little earlier. So in 1980, Saddam Hussein invades Iran. Just as a reminder of how unpredictable and dangerous Saddam Hussein was. And so in 1980, he invades Iran. In 1990, he invades Kuwait. But in the meantime, we have this war, this tanker war going on. So so the Iran-Iraq war runs from 1980 to 1988. It goes on a really long time. And so economics become really important. The countries of the Southern Gulf are supporting Saddam because they don't want to get taken over by the Iranians. And so the Iranians start to attack the economic underpinnings of support for the Iraqis. And this means they're attacking Kuwaiti and Saudi tankers. And so by 1986, the Kuwaitis come to the Soviet Union and the United States and say, hey, can you reflag our tankers in an effort to try and keep the Iranians from attacking the tankers? Now, the bigger picture for the Kuwaitis is usually in the Cold War, when you had a major conflict, either the Soviet or the Union or the United States would take sides. We didn't in this case. The unofficial line was that, both sides are so bad. It's just a pity they both can't lose. And the Soviets aren't very different in practice on this. So both the superpowers stay out of this war. But the Kuwaitis, make us an offer we can't refuse, mainly because we're trying to keep the Soviets out. So we agree to do this. So from the start, we realized that this is a sideshow, that the major war is actually the Iranians and the Iraqis, that we're engaging in a sideshow is what the Navy staff calls it. And so we are going to escort these Kuwaiti tankers. And so the sense is that the very sight of the stars and stripes flying on the stern of a Kuwaiti tanker will deter the Iranians from attacking, and that did not turn out to be the case whatsoever.
It's hard to get into the mind of somebody who's irrational, right? Who has a totally different approach.
This is the point, isn't it? So separately, there's an article in the October 2025 proceedings I've also written, which talks about how unreliable deterrence is as a strategic concept. And I guess right to your point, that it's so difficult for us to get into the mind of our opponents that it is ludicrous for us to base a strategy of deterrence on anything, because you're basically trying to politically predict what your opponent's going to do. And we fail time and time again. So arguably we fail in this one as well. So the first Earnest Will mission, the Iranians mine the strait. So they don't mine the strait actually. They mine the approaches to Kuwait harbor. So we had been ready for attacks. We've been ready for air attacks and surface-to-surface missile attacks and small boat attacks, but we hadn't really focused on mines. And so these poor guys, so we were out in the Gulf of Oman. We're protecting the Constellation. We're a shotgun. So we're not actually part of the convoy effort. So our colleagues are out there, convoying these two tankers all the way through the Persian Gulf, which takes a couple of days. It's high stress. The weather conditions are awful. The radar propagation is difficult. So they're on a high rate of stress. And so they're pulling into Kuwait harbor and they think, okay, this is finished. We've succeeded. And suddenly a mine goes off. It hits the Bridgeton, which is an enormous super tanker. The U.S. ships just sort of form a conga line behind it because while the Bridgeton can take a hit, the small boys can't. And so we go in. So it's interesting. we ran 40, 45 Ernest Will convoys over the next 45 over the next year and a half. That was the only actual convoy that got attacked. So in that sense, these convoy missions, and so the operational name for the convoy escort mission was called Operation Ernest Will. The original name for the operation was Operation Private Jewels, which some bright spark realized is a terrible thing to put out in public. They renamed it Ernest Will. And so that mission itself, the convoy mission, was extremely successful, and that only one convoy was ever attacked, and that was the first one.
And it's interesting that, the idea was, hey, we're going to attack merchant tankers to put economic pressure on Kuwait and other countries along the Gulf there. Boy, that sounds kind of familiar.
Right.
And you say it was a sideshow. Naval battles or naval fights, you talk about it in the book, are a lot different, more limited liability warfare at sea than what you have on land. And that was a little bit of what was going on in the late 1980s in this particular Ernest Will operation. These were all being calculated as to, like, how much do we do? What's a responsible or proportional response? A lot of that strategy or thought process had to go on, didn't it?
It did, and you raise an important point, right? So in a sense, you're doing this in a linear fashion, that I need to get a tanker from point A to point B. And I'm going to chart my course, and I'm going to give it air cover and surface ship cover and that sort of stuff. And so if I apply enough destroyers and frigates and air cover, then this should work. Except we're talking about war, right? Which is, once the violence starts, it's a non-linear process. It becomes non-linear, chaotic, and unpredictable. So these dynamics are at play all through Ernest Will, that we have an idea of what we're doing, but there's so much chance in this that it's what ends up driving the war. And again, arguably, the Ernest Will is bookended by two accidental missile strikes. So the first one is the accidental missile strike against USS Stark, in which Iraqis, rather than the Iranians, it's an Iraqi aircraft that fires off two Exocet missiles and kills 37 sailors aboard the USS Stark. So there's no sense that wasn't accidental, but does really get our focus. We really have the focus on Ernest Will then. And then the operation essentially ends, and the war ends when the USS Vincennes accidentally shoots down a civilian airliner in 1988, which provides the pretext for the Iranians to end the entire Iran-Iraq war. So the Iranians were quite clear on this in accepting a Security Council resolution 598, which ends the war. They specifically cited the USS Vincennes. From the Iranians' perspective, and they've been consistent, they think we deliberately shot down that airliner, and that we would be engaged in, quote unquote, immense crimes going forward if the Iranians did not end the war. I think it's probably more accurate to say that the Iranians were losing the war by 1988. This provided a useful pretext. But the presence of the U.S. Navy in the Persian Gulf, which was there to protect Kuwaiti tankers, ended up inadvertently helping to end the entire war.
Yeah, it sort of two accidents start and end,
right?
And maybe both accidents are pretexts, face-saving methods to find an end.
Yeah, well, certainly the latter one is, but it just is a reminder of the role of contingency and chance in war, because we didn't intend to end the war by doing this.
And you write about this, page 75, about mission creep, reaction. You just sort of have to react to the realities that are going on, and that may take your mission in a direction you weren't even planning on, right?
Right. Once the violence starts, yeah. So I don't think it's any accident that people use fire to describe war. So fire is useful. You can build things, you can heat things, and that sort of stuff. And so you're trying to use fire to create things and to do things. But fire can get out of control, right? It leaps its fire boundaries, and suddenly the fire does stuff that you hadn't predicted. I think that's why people so often liken fire to war.
You talk about and it was used. I don't know if it was used on both sides, but the mining of the shipping lanes, and it's not like that wasn't planned on, because there was a whole effort to then send minesweepers.
Right.
But talk a little bit about that. Now, again, we're in 1980s. We're not talking about what's going on in 2026 yet,
right.
But it's, I want veteran radio listeners to understand from Tom Duffy here, with all of his experience, both as a Navy commander and in the Foreign Service. This is stuff people knew about. The idea that nobody thought about, oh, maybe they'll mine the shipping lanes. So talk to us a little bit about, was that a surprise back in the 80s?
It's interesting. So the CIA actually does some studies on this. And so they look, there's been a series of mining incidents in the Middle East in the 80s by the Libyans in the Red Sea and that sort of stuff. And so the Iranians are watching this and understanding that, hey, this is a deniable form of warfare, and we might be able to do this. But a 1984 declassified CIA assessment says that the Iranians would be unlikely to use that against us because we would be likely to come up with retribution against them. And so we guessed wrong on this. But so there was a sense that, yeah, you could use mines. We also, this is part of the 600 ship Navy, right? And so we had programmed into the 600 ship Navy mine hunters, the Osprey class and these other types of coastal minesweepers. But, even now we have problems getting our ships produced on time. That was the case in the 1970s and 1980s as well. We had great minesweepers and mine hunters designed and paid for, but we had problems getting them out on time. And so when the Bridgeton hits a mine, it's a bit of a surprise, but not a complete surprise. But we don't have any minesweeping assets except in the reserves. We go to the Europeans asking for some help. The Europeans want nothing to do with what is shaping up to be a U.S. versus Iran fight, and they initially decline our requests. So we end up calling all these old minesweepers out from the reserves. It takes forever to get there. But once they do get there, these 1950s minesweepers, right? But they're sweeping Iranian mines which are based on a World War I design. So in terms of once the minesweepers actually get there, they're actually quite effective in taking out these old types of mines.
The other thing that you write about that was happening as a small boat activity, bog hammers, I think is what they're referred to. And again, this is 40 years ago, but sounds familiar today. Talk to us a little bit about, again, was the U.S. Navy surprised by this back in the day, or was this, yeah, we've got to plan around this? What's the best way to deal with it?
Right. And so it's interesting. So I'd argue it isn't a surprise. In fact, in the 1980s, we were much more ready for the small boat attacks than we were the mines. And so it's bog hammers, which are sort of these long Swedish-produced speedboats. There's also Boston whalers, like your normal Boston whaler, that has arms on it. And so we respond a couple different ways. One, we up armor, we bring additional weapons onto the ships. So we bring more 50 cals, the 25 millimeter Bushmasters we're putting on the sides of the ships because they're more effective than the 5-inch in going after these small types of points. So we're, getting ready for this particular threat. But there's a lot of them. And, for those of you who've sailed out in the Gulf, the weather's awful. The visibility is terrible. There's a lot of traffic. And so it's easy for these ships to blend in with the dhows and everything else that's out there. So the chance of surprise attack is really, really high. So it's a real stressor for our guys who are running these convoys, and it's a tribute to them that they were, except for that first convoy, every other Ernest Will convoy was successfully protected all the way through.
Yeah, that right there is an amazing stat, probably lost on most of the general public. But you commented a minute ago, and again, this is history that it ripples forward, or at least rhymes going forward, and that is the burden sharing issue. Back in this particular campaign, it wasn't, burden sharing really wasn't all that shared, was it?
So, but it's an interesting point of comparison of contrast. So, in 1987, we realized, even before Bridgeton gets hit, that we're deficient in some areas, including minesweepers. And so, in May of 1987, Caspar Weinberger is our Secretary of Defense. Now, Caspar Weinberger is not known for being the most solicitous of fellows. I mean, his nickname in the Nixon administration as the OMB budget director was Cap the Knife.
Right.
So he's known for being confrontational when he needs to and that sort of stuff. So Weinberger goes to the May 1987 NATO ministerial, and he asks for assistance, and he puts it in the context of freedom of navigation. And it's not an official NATO ask. So he's not asking NATO to provide forces. Rather, he's asking the member states of NATO, in their individual capacity, to consider sending forces out. Now, this is 1987. The Cold War is still going on. NATO is big into the idea of out of area, right? And so for the NATO folks, for the Americans, look, the Cold War was global. It was there's no such thing as out of area for the United States Navy. But for the Europeans, NATO was regional, and it was focused on Western Europe. So when we asked them to participate in something in the Gulf, their initial response was out of area. So this is way before Afghanistan or Iraq or these types of things. So in 1987, NATO is focused on the Soviet Union, and they're reluctant to operate outside that NATO operating area. But so Weinberger's not making an official ask of NATO, but he's kind of hitting these countries country by country. They initially decline, and Weinberger plays this extremely well. So when his press remarks to the press as he leaves, it's like, hey, we didn't expect to come here with a satchel and filling it on out. So he was measured and tempered in his discussions of the NATO allies. So as the summer goes on, the Iranians start to indiscriminately mine areas, and they mine a place called Khor Fakkan, which is outside the Persian Gulf. It's off the Emirati. It's off an Emirati port, but it's in the Gulf of Oman. So the Europeans say, "Hey, wait a minute, we have all these mines which could hit anything. They're not in the Persian Gulf anymore." And also, I think they had second thoughts about being seen to be not helping the United States. Again, Cold War, you're sending a signal to the Soviet Union. So Margaret Thatcher gets there's an election in Britain in like June of 1987, and she gets a significant majority. She now is in a position to take more risky political decisions. And so she's looking at this. She's looking at indiscriminate Iranian mining. She's looking at the Iran-Contra scandal, which is going on. The hearings are going on all summer at the same time. She's looking at her genuine friendship with Ronald Reagan. I mean, these two are very close. And so Margaret Thatcher writes about this in her memoirs, which is, I needed to help my friend out. And so she overrules her government and sends state-of-the-art minesweepers to the Persian Gulf. The other countries of Western Europe take a look at this, and you sort of get this succession of Me Too. And so
right. Don't want to be left out.
Right. So they also end up sending their minesweepers, but it's national. So the French are operating by themselves. The Belgians and the Dutch are operating by themselves. The Italians are running it by themselves. They're careful publicly to say in capital that this isn't coordinated. We're just there. We're all operating. But at the operational level, on the water, these ships and these crews are able to work very effectively together.
Well, they also don't want to be running into each other or any of those sorts of things. I'm going to use this provision of your book, Tanker War in the Gulf, to turn us to current events, because you write, events drive policy. Policy versus policy driving events. This is at page 128 of the book. And it's like, I wrote that one down. I said, oh boy, this is right where we turn. So here we are in 2026. We find ourselves in the midst of another Iran war. It's got all kinds of land, Air Force, sky issues, dominance of the airspace. But in the middle of all that, other stuff is we're fighting again over who controls the Gulf, the Strait of Hormuz, mining, bog hammers. As you look at it today, with that history and knowledge, Tom Duffy, tell us what you're thinking.
Sure. Let's go over the similarities and the differences. There's a couple similarities. The same geographical area, the same players largely, some of the same sea control threats, missiles, gunfire, mines. We have the same political split between the Europeans and the Americans regarding how best to deal with the Iranians. And then lately, the fight has become the fight for which Operation Earnest Will was articulated, freedom of the seas. So after Stark gets hit, and we lose 37 sailors in this attack, Ronald Reagan goes on national TV and says, hey, look, it's important that freedom of the seas is not an empty cliche. It's important that we do this. So this idea of maintaining freedom of the seas and unrestricted passage through the Strait of Hormuz, same fight. But let's turn to the differences. Yeah, they're the same players, but the players are playing different roles. So in 1987 and 1988, Iran was principally fighting Iraq. Their goal was not to bring the United States in. So they could have targeted us with silkworms and done a lot more damage, but they were arguably pulling their punches. And similarly, we struck a very limited Iranian target set. We didn't hit on land. We did not. There were moves or proposals to hit like the Iranian naval headquarters in Bandar Abbas, to take out the land-based silkworm sites and such. So the operators in the region, very understandably, would make these recommendations, and Washington would think about it and not do it. So that's gone. So I mean, we are the Iranian. We're clearly, there's no question there that we're fighting each other on this in a way that was not the case in 1987, 88. We have just described kind of a kaleidoscope of war aims, from regime change to unconditional surrender to we're kind of on cease nuclear enrichment. I'd argue, we should probably be making more of a focus on freedom of navigation. It's a centuries-old thing for us. Another difference is that those decapitation strikes against the Iranians have left them so decentralized that it's not clear who has the last word on anything in Iran, which is going to complicate your negotiations. So the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps has always been a wild card. It was a wild card in 87 and 88 too. But and now they're just doing stuff that is, I think they just have decentralized execution orders and they're carrying them out, which really complicates things. Some other differences in weapons. We have drones now. The mines are much better. So my colleague Steve Phillips has just put out a book called Poison Chalice. Steve's an ex-EOD guy. It really gets into the mine threat, the growing mine threat, the ways we can counter on this. But that's different. But this is what we would call a character of war change. So the nature of war is always the same. It's violence. It's unpredictable. It's political. The character of war changes how we fight it. We have a character of war change going on with this fight. Much greater economic impact here. You have the International Energy Agency warning that this is much, much worse than what we saw in the 1970s. We're already seeing some impact in East Asia economies. There's widespread expectation of inflation. That wasn't the case in 87. We actually had an oil glut going on. And during the fight, there was never an interruption to the Strait of Hormuz. It's nothing like you see today. Another difference, the force structure is different. Navy force structure. We were the 600-ship Navy in 1987. We are less than half the size of that now. So our weapons are more sophisticated and in many ways better, but we just don't have the same number of hulls. We have less than half the number of hulls. So if you were to do a convoy mission, which is really numbers intensive, right? You just don't have the assets to do it like you did before. And then finally, this is both a similarity and a difference. We get back to the freedom of navigation point. So there's a British naval historian who I studied under, King's, Geoffrey Till, and he observed that, quote, to the great maritime powers, the sea stands for opportunity and freedom. The competing view to this is characteristic of national states of a continental persuasion, who tend to think of the sea in rather the same way they think of land. The sea may sometimes be a source of danger and strategic vulnerability. And so that's what we see going on here. This is a classic fight between a maritime power of the United States and a continental power of the Iranians. Now, for a good 250 years, we're celebrating the 250th anniversary of the establishment of the United States Navy right now. We've always pushed for freedom of the seas, for the ability of ships, and especially trading ships, to be able to go wherever they need to go. So that's what's at jeopardy here. So the stakes are just enormous.
Yeah, it is similar and dissimilar at the same time. And the whole idea of freedom of the seas also brings in some echo of what's going on over in China and our issues in the North China, or I should say South China Sea.
Right. Exactly.
Probably, hopefully, another book you're looking at and another discussion we can have. But we're talking to Tom Duffy. I can refer to him as Commander. I can refer to him, actually, his title in the Foreign Service was Minister Counselor. That's pretty cool. I don't know how you get that on a business card. But he's written a book that by Casemate Publishers called Tanker War in the Gulf, Operation Earnest Will, Diplomacy and Sea Power in Practice. And it just is so timely and provides a history to give us a backdrop of what's going on today with our current problems. Maybe they're always old problems coming back, aren't they, Tom?
I didn't mean for this to be a timely book, right? This is supposed to be a history book, but these challenges just keep coming up again and again.
Well, we appreciate the time you've been able to give us today on Veterans Radio and encourage folks who not only want to know the history book, but maybe a glimpse at how this impacts life today to go out and grab a copy of Tanker War in the Gulf. Tom, thanks for your time today.
Jim, hey, thanks for the chance to talk this morning.
Military veterans touch everyone's life. I'm guessing right now you're thinking of a veteran, a close friend, relative. Maybe it's you. Even the toughest of us sometimes need help, but don't know where to turn for support. You don't need special training to help a veteran in your life. Even small actions can make a world of difference. If you know a veteran in crisis, please call the Veterans Crisis Line, 800-273-8255. 800-273-8255. A message from the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs.
If you have a VA claim denied by the Board of Veterans Appeals, contact Legal Help for Veterans at 1-800-693-4800. They're experts in handling cases before the U.S. Court of Appeals for Veterans Claims. Their number again, 1-800-693-4800.
This second interview on Veterans Radio today, by the way, Veterans Radio is the second oldest veterans radio program in the nation. And today we're going to talk about something that's pretty current, which is the impact of drones and drone injuries on military medicine. So listen in.
We want to welcome to Veterans Radio today a distinguished military and medicine man, Dean Winslow. Colonel, MD, welcome to Veterans Radio.
Good. Well, Jim, thank you so much for inviting me to participate in this program. It's a real honor, and thank you for all you do for all of us veterans.
Well, it's really important to sort of keep up to date with things, and that's kind of why we're having this discussion. You're really up to date and have been training in the area of military medicine for years. You are, I should mention, you're an MD. You're a professor at Stanford Medical School. You've got a really long resume, starting out with joining the Louisiana Air National Guard in 1980 and retiring as a colonel. You did time with the Delaware National Guard. You've had 4 tours in Iraq, 2 tours in Afghanistan. All the way up to work at DOD as well as in the field. Interestingly, though, as a 14-year-old kid, you got your pilot's license, and you've logged 3,000 civilian hours and 1,200 military flying hours, including 431 combat hours and 260 combat sorties. So, no question, you're the guy who knows what we should be talking about. But let's start with, how did a nice kid like you get interested in going in the military?
Oh, gosh. Well, honestly, again, I was born in 1953, and my father, like just about everybody, that greatest generation, served during the Second World War. So for me, that was something that, I always wanted to do. And of course, I loved airplanes. So as we were saying before the interview started, there was only one branch of the service that really appealed to me.
Well, you picked the right one. My wife, as I mentioned, was also in the Air Force and the Michigan Air National Guard and served at the Pentagon. So you guys had some similar things. She was on the nursing side, you're on the MD side. Tell folks who might not be familiar, what does a top doc do when doing these 6 overseas assignments? Because you had various roles over time. So give us a thumbnail of that.
Sure. So first of all, being a flight surgeon, it's kind of an old term that goes back probably to the British ship surgeon. But we're trained in aerospace medicine, and our primary job is to care for aircrew, assigned to a combat unit. We also, have some public health responsibilities and that sort of thing. But again, one of the things the Air Force really, really values is that in addition to being trained as an aerospace medicine doctor, that you also have specialty training and experience in a regular specialty. So medicine, surgery, these are all things that are really valuable additional credentials that they really like in flight surgeons. So again, my 6 deployments after 9/11, they all were a little bit different. So 4 of my 6 deployments, I was basically just there as the squadron flight surgeon, supporting the troops, flying occasional air evac missions. Also, by the way, occasionally just helping out, as a regular crew member. Because of my own interest and background in aviation, they always seem to like, having the doc fly with them.
Who knows a little bit about aeronautics, right? Exactly.
Yeah. And then two of my deployments to Iraq. One was in 2006, so before the surge, when the insurgency was really, I think, at its peak. I was the deputy commander and one of the two emergency room doctors at our Air Force Combat Hospital in Baghdad. And then in 2008, I was asked to come back and command the 447th EMEDS, again, our combat hospital at Baghdad International Airport. So again, those roles basically are, very different than being, just a flight surgeon caring for the air crew. So here we're basically running a combat hospital and seeing both medical and surgical cases, involved in the war.
And one of the things that I think every veteran's kind of aware of, there's sort of a signature or a different set of injuries in every war because the methods of war, the technology of war changes. We're not talking mustard gas in World War I anymore. And you saw that progression occurring during your career where IEDs and blasts, concussion blast, TBI became sort of this signature. I suspect that was consistent with your experience.
Absolutely, Jim. Of course, we still did see, some serious injuries and fatalities from small arms fire. But again, the much more effective like Kevlar helmets that we had and the IBA or body armor that we wore, with ceramic strike plates in front and back and even plates protecting our sides, helped prevent a lot of the fatalities from small arms fire that we saw certainly in the Vietnam and the Korean wars. So again, as you rightly said, that sort of the signature injuries that produced probably about 65%, if not more, of our casualties in both Iraq and Afghanistan were related to improvised explosive devices. And these, range from, fairly simple devices, often buried, underneath, small amounts of dirt, to these very sophisticated, what we called EFPs, or explosively formed penetrator or shape charged IEDs that we saw particularly after 2005 in Iraq. And again, not getting involved with some of the current politics, but again, these actually horrible EFP weapons were supplied by the Iranians to the Shia splinter groups in Iraq. And these injuries were just absolutely devastating because of just the strength of the explosion and the fact that it was all directed one direction. So these devices, which were often coupled with passive IR detectors to actually detect the heat of a passing vehicle, they were so powerful that they could, even if they hit it right, penetrate the armor of an Abrams tank. So certainly a more lightly armored vehicle like a Stryker vehicle or a up-armored Humvee was no match for these horrible EFPs. And I still have bad dreams about, some of the particular body bags that I unzipped of soldiers killed by these terrible devices.
And as you say, it's sort of, man's ingenuity and cruelty leads to changes in warfare. And we've got a couple of wars going on now in the world, in Ukraine and in Iran. And we're seeing both Russia and Ukrainian forces use a different type of unmanned vehicle or drone. And I hadn't really thought about it. And that's why I wanted you on to talk about how that's changed the injuries that soldiers may face. And while military medicine was praised for how quickly it could get to folks in Afghanistan and save lives, it's different now. The damage is different. Talk a little bit about today's current drone warfare and the resulting injuries.
No, absolutely. Be happy to talk about that. Just again, a little bit of background, though, is that we certainly did also see what we call indirect fire, in Iraq and Afghanistan. And by that, we usually mean mortars, but you had to be pretty close to a base to basically lob a mortar in. But we also were attacked occasionally with 81 millimeter rockets in Iraq, and then these large Chinese made Type 63 107 millimeter rockets in Afghanistan. That was, again, the main indirect fire weapon that the Taliban used against us in Afghanistan. So some of the things that we did that were very effective in both Iraq and Afghanistan is that we had our buildings always surrounded just about by what we call T-walls, these large, many cases 15 or so feet high cement barriers. So again, the way that the rockets were fused would be they would basically detonate on impact. So the T-walls provided great protection, unless, he was unlucky enough that a rocket actually came through, the roof of a bee hut, which actually did happen during my last Afghanistan deployment. But otherwise, the T-walls provided good protection against, rockets and mortars. The problem with these drones that are being deployed both in the war in Ukraine as well as in Iran are the fact that these are suicide drones that are able to come at fairly low speed and hover stationary over a target, either personnel or an armored vehicle, and then very precisely basically hover over that area and then detonate above the target. One of the big differences is that, for example, even these large 107 millimeter rockets that our bases would be attacked with in Afghanistan had about, I think, a 2.9 pound warhead, whereas these Shahed 136 drones that are being employed in Iran, they actually have anywhere from a 60 to 110 pound warhead. So it's, an order of magnitude larger. So, again, when you just think about the strength of the blast injuries, that it's pretty devastating. And
the technology is more focused. You said, you hover because there's all kinds of sensors and visuals. Mm-hmm. You might hover over a target and wait for the infantry to move or the personnel carrier to start letting guys out. I mean, we've seen it in the Ukraine videos, what they're doing to the Russians. So it's not only a bigger explosive device, it's a little more honed, again, resulting in slightly different, maybe more than slightly, different injuries.
Absolutely. And again, as I tried to point out, that the T-walls are completely ineffective because the blast is coming from really directly above. And again, there is no protection.
We're when you go and do a little research on this, I'm really again hadn't thought about this, but these drone bomb injuries apparently have more severe traumatic amputations, shrapnel wounds, burns, TBIs, blast waves, and this has been written up in the Lancet and other medical journals over some period of time. But how does that reshape or change the way you think about delivering the sort of military medicine the U.S. forces expect to have and had in the past?
Yeah. So there's a couple of aspects to it. So again, just the fact that the charge is an order of magnitude larger than with a 107, you do see much more, as a general rule, severe injuries. Although, again, if you happen to have stepped on an IED, in a dismounted patrol, a lot of soldiers did lose their legs. But again, you're also going to see, I think, more upper body injuries are what they're seeing, as well. But just the severity of these blast injuries is just so much greater because, again, you're dealing with, essentially a many magnitude larger warhead that's being detonated directly above personnel. The other thing which I'd like to address real briefly, kind of from a tactical standpoint, is that, in Iraq and Afghanistan, we basically had complete air superiority, once we went in on the ground. And so there's this concept in trauma management called the golden hour, where you try to basically stabilize somebody, but get them to an operating room within an hour, so you can have more definitive, care for these traumatic injuries by surgeons. Whereas, we really certainly do not have that type of air superiority in Iran. And that's one thing that just keeps me up at night worrying about that if we do go in on the ground. So again, I think it'll be very difficult, for example, to get troops out that are wounded within that golden hour. And it even puts more pressure on, basically the soldiers, airmen, Marines, buddies to provide what we call tactical combat casualty care to keep people alive for many more hours. But again, though, that's not a substitute though for having definitive surgical care, which we were able to do usually within that golden hour in both Iraq and Afghanistan. So we could get a medevac helicopter in and get that person to a combat support hospital within that hour of time.
We've seen again in Ukraine and Iran these drones come in swarms.
Yes.
I think Israel's and a lot of the Middle East countries are experiencing trying to shoot down swarms of these kind of drones. How do you ramp up the medical training or the medical availability to give that tactical combat casualty care in so many places at once? Do you have to expand who's able to provide it?
Well, so again, the TCCC program, which is a very just absolutely amazing program that's continued to evolve, is primarily directed at essentially soldiers, Marines giving care to each other. So they actually are trained how to insert temporary airways, how to use what we call our CAT or combat application tourniquets, to control hemorrhage. So that's basically not at the level of professionals. This is basically the training that we provide, to infantrymen and to, maintainers and other, airmen and soldiers that are deployed, basically to keep people alive. But again, there's only so much that you can do, if you have to extend that care much beyond that golden hour. And so that's one of the things that I think many of us are concerned about is the fact that we're not going to be able to get people into an operating room in most cases within that hour.
So I think I read something that you've either been reviewing or critiquing or teaching some of this TCCC training. So does the Department of Defense or War, depending on what you want to call it, does it get it? Does it get that medical care has to evolve?
I think it does, and again, but this really is a whole new world, and certainly, that since the war started in Ukraine, this is really, I think, the first, major combat action, where we have, had to deal with, with these drones, and also, as I mentioned, that the fact that we likely will not have the type of air superiority that we benefited from in both Iraq and Afghanistan. In terms of, though, the care that the surgeons provide, that is something that also I've been concerned about over the years. So if you look at actually the active duty medical installations that we have, that they're pretty much, most of them are community hospitals, other than some of the real big ones, like Walter Reed in Washington, D.C., and Brooke Army Medical Center and the Joint Base San Antonio facilities, and also, I guess, well, of course, the Naval Hospital in San Diego is a very much a very sophisticated facility. But most of the hospitals on active duty military installations are really small community hospitals, where they do primary care, pediatrics, some OBGYN, and they'll do some surgery, but it's not the complicated surgery that you would have at a trauma center or even at a university medical center or a large VA hospital. And surgery is like a lot of things that, it requires, practice and currency. And so that's one of the things that actually I raised as an issue at my confirmation hearing to be Assistant Secretary of Defense back in 2017. And I think, we do need to develop more public-private partnerships and make it easier for surgeons in the military who are on these small active duty military hospitals to actually work, in trauma centers so they get, a little bit more recency of experience before they deploy.
Over the last few years, there's been concern about the military making its enlistment goals, right? Having enough force strength across all of the services. I think you're suggesting, or maybe I can get you to say this directly, that you have a concern that we're not enlisting or embracing ways to get the type of surgeons and medical doctors into the military that we need, or into the Guard and Reserve, where they might have kind of this dual role. Can you talk a little bit about the concern about having enough true surgeons in place should we ever need them?
Yeah. Well, we really do. We're doing a good job. I mean, I think recruiting surgeons as well as other, medical specialists, to go into the military. And again, I just have great respect for people that, want to go in and devote anywhere from 4 to more than 20 years of their professional lives in the military. I think it's a noble cause. But again, the point I was trying to make, though, is the fact that on the active duty side, that most of the hospitals that we have in the military, since we've closed many of the large flagship hospitals that we had in the 1970s, most of the hospitals that we have now are fairly small community hospitals. And so, for example, a surgeon might only do a half a dozen surgical cases a week in one of these hospitals, and they might be like laparoscopic hernia repairs or things like that. They're not dealing with major trauma like you would in at Baltimore Shock Trauma Center or University of Cincinnati, where, by the way, we do have partnerships, but not the capacities to train the potentially hundreds of military surgeons that we would need in a conflict. And that also, again, as you kind of alluded to, one place where I was really proud of the job that Guard and Reserve did, during our long wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, because so many of us were deployed, that we did bring more of that recency of experience, to these forward hospitals.
Well, I want to end here a little bit with giving a plug for if there's a medical professional out there, a doctor thinking about maybe military service. You've had a really fascinating career. We could have talked about you being the lead physician for the U.S. Antarctica program, for the National Science Foundation, your work on COVID issues, HIV and infectious diseases, all of your fellows, you're a fellow of the Royal College of Physicians, the American Academy of Pediatrics, Infectious Disease Society of America. But a lot of this is all kind of based on you've had this incredible experience through your military career that led in different directions. Give the plug for guys and gals who might be thinking about it is, should I spend some time in the service with my medical degree?
Yeah, well, I would, of course, say in a heartbeat. In fact, if I were 20 years younger, I would do it again. And because again, it's this wonderful mission. There's this sense of purpose. There's the camaraderie, and the fact that serving your country is one of the noblest things that you can do. So I definitely would encourage people to spend time in the military. But as I said, though, we also need to develop more robust civil military medical relationships, so people can really maintain their currency, particularly in these the surgical fields.
Do you think the DoD today gets that? Are they working on that? Would you like what are you looking for them to do?
Yeah. So again, I think there is certainly an awareness of this, in the military healthcare system. But again, the problem is a little bit of, how do you actually implement it? And, again, you have to have, say, someone on duty, at the base hospital and things. And how do you give them the time off that they can actually go spend a day or so a week on average, at a large civilian trauma center. So I think there's some logistics that have to be worked out.
We're talking to Dr. Dean Winslow, who's a retired colonel, from the Air Force, who's got a long pedigree. He's also a professor at Stanford, on the Stanford faculty. And I wanted to thank you for making us think a little bit about how drone warfare today is changing some of the needs of military medicine and some of the things that maybe need to be worked on into the future. Thanks for your time today, Doctor.
No, thank you, Jim, and thanks again for the good work you're doing.
Hope you enjoyed those. I want to remind you that the Congressional Medal of Honor Society Convention will be held in Detroit from September 29th to October 3rd, 2026, featuring the largest gathering of living Medal of Honor recipients. You can learn more about the upcoming convention and the opportunity to participate by going to medalofhonordetroit.com. We're involved with that organization through Veterans Radio and look forward to meeting some of these men that we've had the opportunity to interview over time. We couldn't do those interviews without our sponsors, including Legal Help for Veterans, 800-693-4800, the Vietnam Veterans of America National, also Vietnam Veterans of America Charles S. Kettles chapter, a Medal of Honor recipient, by the way, in Ann Arbor, Chapter 310, VFW Post 423, American Legion Post 426. We appreciate all of those who give us some support, whether it's small dollars or big dollars. It really becomes necessary to keep the program on the air, which we've been doing now for over 22 years. And I mentioned briefly, we're the second oldest Veterans Radio program in the country. This has been a long time labor of love by my host partner, Dale Throneberry, and we're glad to bring this to you every week. Both these programs on generally Sundays, but also on the podcast every Tuesday. So look it in or check us out on Facebook, and veteransradio.org is where you can find us. And we look forward to bringing you more stories next week of interest to veterans and their friends. We think these are the sort of stories that don't get told by the general press, but are important to know. So until next time on Veterans Radio, you are dismissed.